Part 2, Highlands. Chapter 1, October 11, Thursday. The rain was coming down harder now, and Asakawa turned his wipers on high. The weather at Hakone was liable to change at any moment. The skies had been clear down in Odawara, but the higher he climbed, the moister the air, and as he neared the pass, he'd encountered several pockets of wind and rain. If it had been daytime, he would have been able to guess at the weather on the mountains from the appearance of the clouds over Mount Hakone. But it was night, and his attention was fixed on whatever came into the beams of his headlights. It wasn't until he had stopped the car and looked up at the sky that he'd realized the stars had disappeared. When he'd gotten on the Kodama bullet train at Tokyo Station, the city had still been wrapped in twilight. When he'd rented the car at Atami Station, the moon was still intermittently peeking out from gaps in the clouds. But now the fine water droplets drifting across his headlight beams were growing into a full-fledged downpour pounding on his windshield. The digital clock over the speedometer said 7:32. Asakawa quickly calculated how long it had taken him to come this far. He'd taken the 5:16 down from Tokyo, arriving at Atami at 6:07. By the time he'd left the gates and finished the paperwork at the rent-a-car place, it had been 6:30. He'd stopped at a market and bought 2 packs of cup noodles and a small bottle of whiskey. It had been 7 by the time he'd found his way through the maze of one-way streets and out of town. A tunnel loomed in front of him, its entrance outlined in brilliant orange light. On the other side, just after he'd entered the Atami-Kanami Highway, he should start to see signs for South Hakone Pacific Land. The long tunnel would take him through the Tana Ridge. As he entered it, the sound of the wind changed. At the same time, his flesh, the passenger seat, and everything else in the car was bathed in orange light. He could feel his calm slipping away. He could feel his hackles rise. There were no cars coming from the opposite direction. The wipers squeaked as they rubbed against the now dry windshield. He turned them off. He should reach his destination by 8. He didn't feel quite like flooring it, although the road was empty. Unconsciously, Asakawa was dreading the place he was heading to. At 4:20 this afternoon, Asakawa had watched as a fax had crawled out of the machine at the office. It was a reply from the Atami Bureau, and he had expected it to contain a copy of the Villa Log Cabin's guest register for August 27th through the 30th. When he saw it, he did a little dance. His hunch was right. There were 4 names he recognized: Nonoyama, Tomoko Oishi, Haruko Tsuji, and Takehiko Nomi. The 4 of them had spent the night on the 29th in cabin B4. Obviously, Shuichi Iwata had used Nonoyama's name. With this, he knew when and where the 4 had been together. On Wednesday, August 29th, at South Hakone Pacific Land, Villa Log Cabin, number B4. It was exactly a week prior to their mysterious deaths. There and then, he'd picked up the receiver and dialed the number for the Villa Log Cabin to make a reservation for tonight for cabin B4. All he had tomorrow was a staff meeting at 11. He could spend the night down in Hakone and easily be back in time. Well, that's it. I'm going. The actual place. He was eager. Never in his wildest dreams could he imagine what awaited him. There was a toll booth just as he came out of the tunnel, and as he handed over 300 yen coins, he asked the attendant, "Is South Hakone Pacific Land ahead?" He knew full well it was. He checked his map any number of times. He just felt like it had been a long time since he'd seen another human being, and something within him wanted to talk. "There's a sign just up ahead. Make a left there." He took his receipt. With so little traffic, it hardly seemed worth having someone stationed here. How long was this guy planning to stand there in his booth? Asakawa made no move to drive off, and the man began to give him a suspicious look. Asakawa forced a smile and pulled away slowly. The joy he'd felt a few hours ago at establishing a common time and place for the 4 victims had withered and died. Their faces flickered behind his eyelids. They died exactly 1 week after staying in Villa Log Cabin. Now's the time to turn back, they seemed to be telling him, leering. But he couldn't turn back now. First of all, his instincts as a reporter had kicked into gear. On the other hand, there was no denying that he was scared to be going alone. If he'd called Yoshino, chances were he would have come running, but he didn't think having a colleague along was such a good idea. Asakawa had already written up his progress so far and saved it on a floppy disk. What he wanted was someone who wouldn't run around getting in his way, but simply help him pursue this. It wasn't like he didn't have someone in mind. He did know one man who would tag along out of pure curiosity. He was a part-time lecturer at a university, so he had plenty of free time. He was just the guy. But he was idiosyncratic. Asakawa wasn't sure how long he could take his personality. There on the mountainside was the sign for South Hakone Pacific Land. There was no neon, just a white panel with black lettering. If he'd happened to be looking away when his headlights hit it, he would have missed it completely. Asakawa turned off the highway and began climbing a mountain road between terraced fields. The road seemed awfully narrow for the entrance to a resort, and he had lonely visions of a dead ending in the middle of nowhere. He had to shift down to negotiate the road's steep, dark curves. He hoped he didn't encounter anybody coming from the opposite direction. There was no room for 2 cars to pass. The rain had let up at some point, although Asakawa had just noticed it. The weather pattern seemed different east and west of the Tana Ridge. At any rate, the road didn't dead end, but kept climbing higher and higher. After a while, he started to see summer homes scattered here and there on the sides of the road, and the road suddenly widened to 2 lanes. The surface improved drastically, and elegant streetlights graced the shoulders. Asakawa was amazed at the change. The minute he entered the grounds, Pacific Land, he was confronted with lavish accoutrements. So what was with the garden path that led here? The corn and weeds hanging over the road had narrowed it even further, tightening his nervousness over what lay around the next hairpin curve. The 3-story building on the other side of the spacious parking lot doubled as an information center and a restaurant. Without thinking twice, Asakawa parked in front of the lobby and walked toward the hall. He looked at his watch, 8 on the nose, right on schedule. From somewhere he heard the sound of balls bouncing. There were 4 tennis courts below the center, with several couples giving it their all under the yellowish lights. Surprisingly, all 4 courts were occupied. Asakawa couldn't fathom what made people come all the way up here at 8 on a Thursday night in the middle of October just to play tennis. Far below the tennis courts, he could see the distant lights of the city of Mishima and Numazu glittering in the darkness. The emptiness beyond, black as tar, was Tago Bay. Entering the information center, the restaurant was directly in front of him. Its outer wall was glass, so he could see inside. Here Asakawa got another surprise. The restaurant closed at 8, but it was still half full of families and young women in groups. What was going on here? He cocked his head in puzzlement. Where had everybody come from? He couldn't believe all these people came here on the same road that had brought him here. Maybe what he had used was the back entrance. There must be a brighter, wider road somewhere else, but that was how the girl he'd spoken to on the phone had told him to get there. Go about halfway down the Atami Kanami Road and turn left. Drive up the mountain from there. Asakawa had done just that. It was inconceivable that there was another way out of here. Nodding as he was told that it was past time for last orders, he went into the restaurant. Below its wide windows, a carefully groomed lawn sloped gently through the night towards the cities. The inside lights were kept intentionally low, probably to better allow customers to enjoy the view of distant lights. Asakawa stopped a passing waiter and asked where he could find a villa log cabin. The waiter pointed back toward the entry hall Asakawa had just come through. Follow that road to the right about 200 meters. You'll see the office. Is there a parking lot? You can park in front of the office. That was all there was to it. If he had just kept going instead of stopping in here, he would have found it on his own. Asakawa could more or less analyze why he'd been drawn to this modern building, to the point of barging into the restaurant. He found it somehow comforting. All the way here, he had been imagining dark, utterly primitive log cabins, the perfect backdrop for a Friday the 13th scenario, and there was nothing of that in this building. Faced with this proof that the power of modern science functioned here too, he felt somewhat reassured, strengthened. The only things that bothered him were the bad road that led here from the world below, and the fact that, in spite of it, there were so many people playing tennis and enjoying their dinner here in the world above. He wasn't sure exactly why this bothered him. It was just that, somehow, nobody here seemed quite lifelike. Since the tennis courts and restaurant were crowded, he should have been able to hear the cheerful voices of people from the log cabins. That's what he expected. But standing at the edge of the parking lot, looking down over the valley, he could discern only about 6 of the 10 cabins built among the trees scattered over the gentle slope. Everything below was immersed in the darkness of the forest, beyond the pale of the street lamps, unrelieved by any light coming from inside the cabins. B4, where Asakawa would be spending the night, seemed to stand on the border between the darkness and the lighted area. All he could see was the top of the door. Asakawa walked around front, opened the office door, and stepped inside. He could hear a television, but there was no sign of anyone. The manager was in a Japanese-style room in the back, off to the left, and hadn't noticed Asakawa. Asakawa's view was blocked by the counter, and he couldn't see into the room. The manager seemed to be watching an American movie on video, not a TV program. He could hear English dialogue as he watched the flickering light from the screen reflected in the glass of a cabinet out front. The built-in cabinet was full of videotapes, neatly lined up in their cases. Asakawa placed his hand on the counter and spoke up. Immediately, a small man in his 60s stuck his head out and bowed, saying, "Oh, welcome." He must be the same man who had so cheerfully showed the guest register to the guy from the Atami Bureau and the lawyer, thought Asakawa, smiling back at him pleasantly. "I have a reservation, name of Asakawa." The man opened his notebook and confirmed the reservation. "You're in B4. Can I get you to write your name and address here?" Asakawa wrote his real name. He just sent Notoyama's membership card back to him, so he couldn't use it. "Just you, then?" The manager looked up at Asakawa suspiciously. He'd never had anybody stay here alone. At non-member rates, it was more economical for one person to stay at the hotel. The manager handed over a set of sheets and turned to the cabinet. "If you'd like, you're free to borrow one. We have most of the popular titles." "Oh, you rent videos?" Asakawa ran his gaze casually over the titles of the videos covering the wall. Raiders of the Lost Ark, Star Wars, Back to the Future, Friday the 13th. All popular American films, mostly science fiction. A lot of new releases, too. Probably the cabins are mostly used by young people. There was nothing that grabbed him. Besides, Asakawa had ostensibly come here to work. "I'm afraid I brought work with me." Asakawa picked up his portable word processor from where he'd placed it on the floor and showed the manager. Seeing it, the manager seemed to understand why he was staying here alone. "So there are dishes and everything?" Asakawa said, just to make sure. "Yes, use anything you like." The only thing Asakawa needed to use, though, was a kettle to boil water for his cup of noodles. He took the sheets and his room key from the manager, who told him how to find B4, and then said with odd formality, "Please, make yourself at home." Before touching the knob, Asakawa put on his rubber gloves. He'd brought them to give him peace of mind, as a charm to ward off the unknown virus. He opened the door and flipped on the light switch in the entry hall. A 100-watt bulb lit a spacious living room. Papered walls, carpet, floor, four-person sofa, television, dinette set. Everything was new, everything was functionally arranged. Asakawa took off his shoes and went in. There was a balcony on one edge of the living room, and small Japanese-style rooms on the first and second floor. It was a little luxurious for a single guest, after all. He drew the lace curtains and opened the sliding glass door to allow the night air in. The room was perfectly clean, as if to betray his expectations. It suddenly occurred to him that he might go home clueless. He went into the Japanese-style room off the living room and checked the closet. Nothing. He took off his shirt and slacks and changed into a sweatshirt and sweatpants, hanging his street clothes in the closet. Next he went upstairs and turned on the light in the Japanese-style room. "I'm acting like a child," he thought wryly. Before he'd realized it, he'd turned on every single light in the place. With everything sufficiently illuminated, he now opened the bathroom door gently. He checked inside first and left the door slightly ajar while he was inside. It reminded him of his fear rituals as a child, when he was too scared to go to the bathroom alone on summer nights. He used to leave the door open a crack and have his dad stand watch outside. A neat shower room stood behind a pane of frosted glass. There wasn't even a hint of steam, and the area outside the tub and the tub itself were both dry as a bone. It must have been some time since anybody had stayed here. He went to take off his rubber gloves. They stuck to his sweaty hands. The cool highlands breeze blew into the room, disturbing the curtains. Asakawa filled a glass with ice from the freezer and poured it half full of the whiskey he had brought. He was about to top it off with tap water, but then hesitated. Turning off the tap, he persuaded himself that he'd really rather have it straight on the rocks. He didn't have the courage to put anything from this room into his mouth. He'd been careless enough to use ice cubes from the freezer, but he was under the impression that microorganisms didn't like extreme heat or cold. He sank back deep into the sofa and turned on the TV. Singing filled the room, some new pop idol. A Tokyo station was showing the same program right about now. He changed channels. He didn't really intend to watch anything, though, so he adjusted the volume to a suitable level and then opened his bag. He took out a video camera and placed it on the table. If anything strange happened, he wanted to catch it all on tape. He sipped a mouthful of whiskey. It was only a little, but it plucked up his courage. Asakawa went over in his head again everything he knew. If he couldn't find a clue here tonight, then the article he was trying to write would be dead in the water. But on the other hand, maybe it was better that way. If not finding a clue meant not picking up the virus, well, after all, he had a wife and child to think about. He didn't want to die, not in some weird way. He propped his feet up on the table. "So what are you waiting for?" he asked himself. "Aren't you afraid? Hey, shouldn't you be afraid? The angel of death might be coming to get you." His gaze darted around the room nervously. Asakawa couldn't fix his eyes on any one point on the wall. He had the feeling that if he did so, his fears would begin to take physical form while he watched. A chill wind blew in from outside, stronger than before. He closed the window, and as he went to draw the curtains, he happened to glance at the darkness outside. The roof of B5 was directly in front of him, and in its shadow, the darkness was even deeper. There had been lots of people on the tennis courts and in the restaurant, but here Asakawa was alone. He shut the curtains and looked at his watch. 8:56. He hadn't even been in this room for 30 minutes. It easily could have been an hour or more, he felt. But just being here wasn't dangerous in and of itself. He tried to believe that to calm himself down. After all, how many people must have stayed in B4 in the 6 months since these cabins were built? It wasn't like all of them had died under mysterious circumstances. Only those 4, according to his research. Maybe if he dug deeper, he'd find more, but at the moment, that appeared to be all. Thus, simply being here wasn't the problem. The problem was what they'd done here. So what did they do here? Asakawa then suddenly rephrased the question. What could they have done here? He'd found nothing resembling a clue. Not in the bathroom, not in the bath, not in the closet, not in the fridge. Even assuming there had been something, the manager would have disposed of it when he cleaned the place. Which meant that, instead of sitting here drinking whiskey, he should be talking to the manager. That would be quicker. He drained his first glass. He made his second a little smaller. He couldn't afford to get drunk. He put a lot of ice in it, and this time he cut it with tap water. His sense of danger must have been numbed a little. He suddenly felt foolish. Stealing time from work, coming all the way up here. He took off his glasses, washed his face, then looked at his reflection in the mirror. It was the face of a sick man. Maybe he'd already caught the virus. He gulped down the whiskey and water he just made and fixed himself another. Returning from the dining room, Asakawa noticed a notebook on the shelf beneath the telephone stand. The cover said, Memories. He leafed through a few pages. Saturday, April 7th. Nonko will never forget this day. Why? That's a S-E-C-R-E-T. Yuichi is wonderful. Nonko. Inns, B&Bs, and the like often had notebooks like this in the room so that the guests could write down their memories and impressions. On the next page was a crude drawing of Mommy and Daddy. Must have been a family trip. It was dated April 14th, also a Saturday, naturally. Daddy's fat, Mommy's fat, so I'm fat too. April 14th. Asakawa kept turning pages. He could feel some sort of force urging him to open the pages at the end of the book, but he kept going through them in order. He was afraid that if he messed up the chronology, he might miss something. He couldn't say for sure, since there were probably a lot of guests who didn't write anything, but it seemed like there were only people here on Saturdays until summer started. After that, the time between each entry shrank. By the end of August, there was a steady stream of entries lamenting the end of summer. Sunday, August 20th. Another summer vacation come and gone, and it sucked. Somebody help me. Rescue poor little me. I have a motorbike, 400cc. I'm pretty good looking. A bargain. AY. This guy looked like he decided the guest book was a means to advertise himself, maybe find a pen pal. It looked like a lot of people had the same ideas about the place. When couples stayed here, their entries showed it, while when single people stayed, they read about how much they wanted a companion. Still, it made for interesting reading. Presently, his watch showed 9 o'clock. Then he turned the page. Thursday, August 30th. Ulp, consider yourself warned. You better not see it unless you've got the guts. You'll be sorry you did. That was all there was to the message. August 30th was the morning after the 4 had stayed here. The initials SI would stand for Shuichi Iwata. His entry was different from all the rest. What did it mean? You'd better not see it. What in the world was it? Asakawa closed the guest book and looked at it from the side. There was a slight gap where it didn't close tightly. He put his finger there and opened it to that page. Ulp, consider yourself warned. You'd better not see it unless you've got the guts. You'll be sorry you did. Evil laughter, SI. The words jumped out at him. Why did the book want to open to this exact page? He thought for a moment. Perhaps the 4 had opened the book here and set something heavy on top of it. The weight had created the force that remained even now, trying to open this page. Maybe whatever they'd placed on top of the page was the it that he'd better not see. That must be it. Asakawa looked around anxiously, searching every corner of the shelf beneath the telephone stand. Nothing. Not even a pencil. He sat back down on the sofa and continued reading. The next entry was dated Saturday, September 1st, but it said only the usual things. It didn't say if the group of students who had stayed here had seen it. None of the remaining pages mentioned it either. Asakawa closed the guest book and lit a cigarette. You'd better not see it unless you've got the guts. He imagined that it must be something frightening. He opened the notebook at random and pressed down on the page lightly. Whatever it was must have been heavy enough to overcome the page's tendency to close. One or two photos of ghosts, for example, wouldn't have done the trick. Maybe a weekly or a hardcover book. Anyway, something you look at. Maybe he'd ask the manager if he remembered finding anything strange left in the cabin after the guests had checked out on August 30th. He wasn't sure if the manager would even remember, but he figured that if it had been strange enough, he would. Asakawa began to get to his feet when the VCR in front of him caught his eye. The TV was still on, showing a famous actress chasing her husband around with a vacuum. A home appliance commercial. Yeah, a VHS tape would be heavy enough to keep the notebook open, and they might have had one handy too. Still in a crouch, Asakawa ground out his cigarette. He recalled the video collection he had seen in the manager's office. Maybe they'd happened to watch a particularly interesting horror flick and thought they'd recommend it to the next guests. Hey, this one's cool, check it out. If that's all that it was. But wait, if that was it, why hadn't Shuichi Iwata used the name? If he wanted to tell somebody that, say, Friday the 13th was a great movie, wouldn't it have been easier to just say Friday the 13th was a great movie? He didn't need to go to all the trouble of actually leaving it on top of the notebook. So maybe it was something that didn't have a name, something that could only indicate with the word it. Well, worth checking out? Well, he certainly didn't have anything to lose, not with no other clues presenting themselves. Besides, sitting around here thinking wasn't getting him anywhere. Asakawa left the cabin, climbed the stone steps, and pushed open the office door. Just as before, there was no sign of the manager at the counter, only the sound of the television coming from the back room. The guy had retired from his job in the city, and decided to live out his years surrounded by Mother Nature, so he'd taken a job as a manager at a resort. But the work turned out to be utterly boring, and now all he did every day was watch videos. That's how Asakawa interpreted the manager's situation. Before he had a chance to call the guy, though, he crawled to the doorway and stuck his head out. Asakawa spoke somewhat apologetically. I thought I'd maybe borrow a video after all. The manager grinned happily. Go right ahead, whichever you'd like. They're only 300 yen each. Asakawa scanned the titles for scary-looking movies. The Legend of Hell House, The Exorcist, The Omen. He had seen them all in his student days. Nothing else? There had to be some he hadn't seen. He searched from one end of the shelf to the other, and saw nothing that looked likely. He started over, reading the titles of every one of the 200 or so videos. And then, on the very bottom shelf, way over in the corner, he noticed a video without a case, fallen over on its side. All the other tapes were encased in jackets with photos and imposing logos, but this one lacked even a label. What's that there? After he'd asked the question, Asakawa realized that he'd used the pronoun that as he pointed to the tape. If it didn't have a name, what else was he supposed to call it? The manager gave a bothered frown and replied, none too brightly, Huh? Then he picked up the tape. This? This isn't anything. Hey, I wonder if this guy even knows what's on that tape. Have you seen it? That one, asked Asakawa. Let me see. The manager cocked his head repeatedly as if he couldn't figure out what something like this was doing here. If you don't mind, could I borrow that tape? Instead of replying, the manager slapped his knee. Ah, I remember now. It was kicking around in one of the rooms. I just figured it was one of ours and brought it here, but... This wouldn't have happened to be in B4, I don't suppose, Asakawa asked slowly, pressing the point home. The manager laughed and shook his head. I haven't the foggiest. It was a couple of months ago. Asakawa asked once more. Have you seen this video? The manager just shook his head. The smile disappeared from his face. No. Well, let me rent it. You're going to record something on the TV? Yeah, well, The manager glanced at the video. The tab is broken, see? You can't record on it. Maybe it was the alcohol, but Asakawa was getting irritated. I'm telling you to rent it to me, you idiot. Just hand it over, he griped to himself. But no matter how drunk he was, Asakawa was never able to come on very strong with other people. Please, I'll bring it right back. He bowed. The manager couldn't figure out why his guest was showing so much interest in this old thing. Maybe there was something interesting on it, something somebody had forgotten to erase. Now he'd wished he'd watched it when he found it. He felt the sudden temptation to watch it right now, but he couldn't very well refuse now that a guest had asked for it. The manager handed over the tape. Asakawa reached for his wallet, but the manager stopped him with his hand. "That's all right. You don't need to pay. I can't charge you for this, now can I?" Thanks a lot. I'll bring it right back." "If it turns out to be interesting, then please do." The manager's curiosity had piqued. He'd already seen every video here at least once, and most of them had ceased to interest him. How did I miss that one, anyway? It would have killed a few hours. But it was probably only has some stupid TV show recorded on it anyway. The manager was sure the video would come right back